Today I'm going to explain how to change a country's currency from one currency to another. Changing a country's currency sounds like a complicated process, but my goal is to explain the process of dollarization, that is, changing one currency or one money system into dollars, in a way that non-economists can follow, and to use the real-world case of Argentina to explain both why and how it might successfully dollarize. I am Sebastian Guerin, and this lecture is Routes to Argentine Dollarization. Dollarization is not one thing. Like many abstract nouns, it means different things to different people and can be used in a variety of ways. But a definition that I think most people can get behind is it is the process by which a country's institutions and policies either allow or favor the US dollar as the money of that nation. It's usually marked by allowing local currency to be converted into the US dollar, allowing dollars to circulate, denominating bank deposits and bank accounts in US dollars, allowing dollars to pay taxes, and similar policies. So dollarization is not one thing or one policy, and there's a lot of different policies that can be called dollarization. It can happen by degrees, be more or less total. It can be solidified in a country through different regimes and legal mechanisms. All of those choices contribute to what we might call a dollarization regime. One way to understand dollarization is to bring it back to the standard economics definition of what money is. Money is a means of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. So, back to means of exchange. You might want to use US dollars because you have faith that other people want or accept US dollars. The only thing one wants to use as a means of exchange or a medium of exchange is a money or currency which is widely accepted. If you want to connect with businesses or corporations that use the US dollar, you will connect with them more easily by using the US dollar yourself. Similarly, by having entire processes run in US dollars, it reduces the transaction costs by making it easier to have contracts and do negotiations and decreasing the risk across parties because the risks to any single currency are the same. So, if I'm dealing with US dollars and you're dealing with US dollars, we're both dealing with US dollar risks. But if I'm dealing with US dollars and you are dealing with Greek drachmas, then I have to deal with Greek drachma risk and you with US dollar risk. And that is a reason to all be on the same currency, to get rid of the Greek drachma and replace it with the euro. Simply reducing transaction costs creates an economic integration, allowing for supply chains to reach further throughout the world. And this is a great reason to be on the US dollar. The US is the largest economy in the world with much of the most advanced technology. If you want to connect to either the US financial system or the physical supply chain, USD will be part of the conversation. If your currency isn't accepted everywhere, that is a reason to ditch it. The store of value function of money is something the US dollar is also quite good at. It's a fairly stable currency. The Federal Reserve Bank is fairly trustworthy, certainly more trustworthy than most people's alternatives, and that's an attractive reason to adopt the US dollar, especially if your country goes through a lot of monetary fluctuations currently. While no one can guarantee that your trust in the Federal Reserve is a perfect trust in an infallible institution, it is likely better than your alternative. If you have high inflation and a lot of volatility, then the USD is definitely a better alternative. Now, the reasons Argentina might want to dollarize are pretty clear. Since 1945, the average inflation in Argentina per year has been 62%. But that 62% is not constant. It is a wildly fluctuating target. This inflation volatility of Argentina is fed largely by government debt. And as a result of government debts going out of control, Argentina has defaulted on its debts 9 times and has had to do a lot of debt restructuring, which is a fancy way of saying going bankrupt and then finding ways to renegotiate all the loans. Because of Argentina's troubled financial history, anything they can do to reduce the risk in the eyes of investors of Argentine default in the long term is going to be very good for debt levels and the fiscal reliability of Argentina's government. Governments are frequently tempted to do patronage through debt issuance. That is, to take out giant loans so that they can give political friends money, both the coalitions that elected them and their own literal friends. And so this temptation can be removed by making it impossible to do. So Argentina is a prime candidate for dollarization. It's a country that would benefit from it. But at the same time, it's a country that has a very difficult dollarization path ahead of it compared to some other countries who might choose to dollarize. And so, with that said, we can talk about how dollarization would occur. In the average case, dollarization is a pretty simple 4-step process. The country has an exchange rate to the dollar with its current currency. It converts all the bank deposits from being in that money to US dollars at the going exchange rate. And then it converts its central bank holdings to US dollars, changing its denomination, and then it secures the new regime through legal institutional mechanisms that guarantee its longevity. The first objection you might have, just in abstract to this process, is that when you start converting bank deposits to USD, then the currency that you have in the original currency will start losing value really rapidly, thus driving the exchange rate, just making the exchange rate even higher, making the conversion less and less until that currency collapses. I myself am not totally clear on the dynamics here, but based on my understanding, changing the unit from say Greek drachmas or Argentine pesos into USD does not actually change. Because that does not change your physical economy. You should be able to honor that original exchange rate. The next step is converting the central bank holdings into USD. Should be possible for exactly those same reasons. And this, though, is immediately where we run into trouble for Argentina. Argentina cannot simply establish an exchange rate to the dollar and start converting pesos into dollars for the following reason. Argentina has a government-mandated exchange rate from the peso to the dollar. The US dollar is mandated to be worth 840 pesos, but on the black market and the flower shop bodegas of Buenos Aires, the informal rate is around 1,100 pesos to the dollar. This 20-25% difference is huge. And so we do not, in some sense, know the equilibrium peso to dollar exchange rate. And for this process to work, the peso to dollar exchange rate has to be close to the actual market exchange rate. And there's only two ways to figure out what that is. The first is to lift the capital controls, and the second is to make an estimate. The reason we can't convert all the bank accounts from pesos to dollars at the 800 to 1 exchange rate is because the purchasing power of 800 pesos is not the same as the purchasing power of $1. Argentina does not currently legalize the exchange of US dollars in the country. The reason for that is obvious. If the official exchange rate is 800 pesos is worth $1, then if I have 800 pesos, I should be able to go to the government and get $1. And then I take that dollar to a bodega and get 1,000 pesos. And then I take the 1,000 pesos and get $1.20. And then I take that $1.20 and so on, getting an infinite amount of dollars and breaking the official rate. So there's capital controls on the flow of US dollars in the Argentine economy to stop this type of gamesmanship from happening. So we need an equilibrium price. We need to legalize the use of dollars. And when we do that, we've at least begun the process of dollarization. There are some problems and fears that people have about just doing this step, and two of them are quite legitimate. The first one is bank runs. You might worry that if we say now you can change your pesos into dollars, everyone will be running to the bank to put in their pesos and get out dollars, causing a bank run if the bank does not have dollars to cover all of that activity. However, there shouldn't be any bank runs as long as there's an equilibrium exchange rate, and that stops that problem. Another worry would be a dollar shortage. There's not enough George Washingtons, Abe Lincolns, and Ben Franklins in currency in order to do a bunch of transactions in dollars on the street. Well, that's true. But if we're at an equilibrium exchange rate, we could use the pesos as cash and we could still do digital payments denominated in dollars. And because we have the equilibrium exchange rate, that process should work fine. And then thirdly, this isn't a problem, but it's like a less extreme solution. Why totally dollarize when we could just allow the pesos and dollars to coexist forever? They call that a currency competition regime. Well, the problem with it is that type of currency competition regime might get a few more dollars circulating in the economy, but it's not credible as a new monetary regime. And if you recall from the beginning of our discussion, the whole idea of doing a giant monetary change like this is to establish a better credit rating for the country and to make long-term loans and transactions more attractive. And you're not going to be able to do that through currency competition alone because it's too easy to just take the dollars and run. And this is part of the history and expectations problem, where in the past, Argentina did have convertibility of pesos to US dollars, and at the end of that regime, essentially the dollars were confiscated by the government, frozen in bank accounts and then confiscated by the government. And so it's just not credible to allow currency competition because there's lots of risk of the government reneging on that deal. How can you have such a regime of dollarization that doesn't somehow wind up being corrupted through opportunistic financial practices of the central government? And central bank liabilities. This is the biggest problem and fear. The Central Bank of Argentina has more liabilities than it has assets. And the reason the peso to dollar exchange rate that we talked about earlier is the 820 to 1 is so that the assets do equal the liabilities. Without that mandated government enforced exchange rate with the capital controls, the central bank would become sunk and Argentina would have another default on its debt. Another default, another round of inflation, more economic pain, more industries harmed, more Argentines suffer. So we really don't want that. And the whole idea of coming up with a dollarization solution is not to burn it all to the ground and build it back up. It's to, as painlessly as possible, take a country, doesn't have to be Argentina, any country that's struggling with its monetary system, and give it something better that's more helpful and doesn't require hurting the common people or the common business of that country. And this is achievable with some hard work and some somewhat inventive thinking. But this is the big problem that is stopping Argentina's dollarization process from getting off the ground in the first place, that the central bank liabilities are so high. So the central bank doesn't have enough money. If we look at its balance sheet, we can see that if the exchange rate is set to $850, then its total assets basically perfectly equal its liabilities. Our problem is like this. We want to denominate these liabilities and assets in dollars instead of peso dollars at the official rate. The central bank cannot sell the securities it owns like the Federal Reserve of the United States would do, because that's illegal in Argentina. In the United States, if the Federal Reserve wants money, it sells the government bonds that it owns. So the Federal Reserve owns a bunch of U.S. treasuries. It sells those treasuries if it wants cash quick, and it buys treasuries if it wants to give the economy cash quick. That's called an open market operation of the Federal Reserve. We've been doing these all the time since 2008, but they're not legal in Argentina, and it probably wouldn't even matter if it were legal, because the government cannot issue new debt because no one wants Argentine debt. That's why Argentina's inflation rate is currently above 100%. So what can they do? They need to reduce the debt. That's the thing. If we can reduce the central bank's debt, then everything else in our process can actually start to happen. That four-step process that begins with an equilibrium exchange rate can only happen in Argentina once the assets of the central bank outweigh the liabilities at something approximating a reasonable exchange rate. And so there's a proposed process for reducing the debt and creating a credible dollarization system more or less at the same time. And here's how it works. If Argentina sets up a fund outside of Argentina under the legal jurisdiction of a country like the United States or the UK, then it could transfer all the central bank assets to that fund. It could also transfer bond liabilities to that fund. And we could call that fund the Monetary Stabilization Fund. And that fund's goal is to pay off those liabilities, those securities of the federal government that it owns. In order to do that, it issues a note that represents each of those bonds or those securities, and it uses those assets to slowly but surely pay those notes. And it does that in short spurts, and it allows investors to buy those notes if they want them. Once enough bond liabilities have been paid off, they can end the monetary stabilization fund and begin the true dollarization process of equilibrating the peso to the dollar officially, lifting the capital controls, having all of the banks denominate bank account holdings in USD instead of pesos. So why this method? Number one, by setting up the fund outside of Argentina, it means the government will not easily be able to take the dollars to pay off its debts and then immediately turn around and reissue new debts in some type of spending spree. Having assets and liabilities controlled by a fund whose only goal is debt reduction is credible. And by having a credible system that actually decreases the pain of current debt, because the lower the risk of Argentine debt, the more valuable it is to hold it and get paid back on it, and the more valuable it is for people to own Argentine debt, the easier it's going to be to pay it off for Argentina. That credibility stabilizes the value of the debt. So the target to pay off doesn't move much. It's a very virtuous cycle whenever you can do something that establishes credibility in monetary financial economics. So if Argentina can do something like this system to reduce the debt, then it can establish a lot of credibility fairly quickly. It can issue notes that represent its debts that it needs to pay off, and people can buy those notes. So that's our conclusion. Reduce the debt, set an exchange rate, and dollarize. Thank you, and special thanks to Rashid Griffith and Nicolas Kachanowski for their help and articles in thinking about this topic.
Pero que sea vos.
Here is a little addendum and explanation of what the Monetary Stabilization Fund does in its issuance of asset-backed commercial paper that matches those liabilities of the Argentine Central Bank. I have puzzled over this for a while, and I have some questions that I still want answered, and I'll cover them in this little addendum section. Feel free to skip it if these intricacies aren't your thing. What the Monetary Stabilization Fund can do is it can take the LELIQs, which it's not allowed to get rid of, and create a note that represents each of those securities or liabilities of the central bank. It can then use its assets to guarantee, it can then use its assets and match them with the securities to guarantee that they'll get paid off. And then it can sell those coupons that represents the security, and people can buy it and trade it and sell it, but it's guaranteed to get paid off because of the asset that's underwriting it. And since the asset is going to pay it off, people can buy the debt, and the central bank can immediately, or it's not the central bank, and the Monetary Stabilization Fund can immediately get some cash to pay off the debt, or to, I don't know what it does with the asset-backed commercial paper. I suppose it sells it. It has to sell it. But my question and concern is largely, what is the exact composition of the liabilities of the Argentine Central Bank? At what rates are they growing? How are the assets constructed? Are the assets growing or shrinking compared to the liabilities? These are some questions that would have to be solved by the Monetary Stabilization Fund in order to try and match assets to liabilities intelligently and quickly start paying off this debt.